My name is Jay Sugarman, and I want to welcome you to Museum Open House. This ongoing series features and highlights many of the outstanding museums and other cultural institutions. The main purpose of most programs is to inform viewers about current and upcoming exhibits, various programs, resources, and other opportunities that are available for the general public. Today, via Zoom, we're fortunate to have as our guest George Schwartz from the Peabody Essex Museum. George serves as curator-at-large at the museum, and he's here today to inform us about the much anticipated reopening of the East India Marine Hall, bringing new life and new perspective to a space that has been at the center of Salem's international story since 1825. From ship models to striking artifacts gathered from around the world, this reimagined hall invites visitors to explore at their own pace and discover the stories that connect Salem to the wider world. During the program, we'll find out why and how the installation came about. We'll go on a behind the scenes tour and in the process come to better understand and appreciate what's new, what's been preserved, and why this iconic hall continues to resonate today. Let's start by meeting George and then learn all about the recent reopening of the East India Marine Hall. Welcome, George. So delighted to be able to be here.
Well, it's wonderful to be here with you, Jay. Thank you for having me.
I had the wonderful opportunity the other day to visit the museum, tour the hall, came away so impressed with the whole presentation, the layout, not to mention the incredible digital edition that we'll hear about during our conversation. Eager to find out more and have you inform viewers. But before we jump right to that, I think it would be of interest if you'd briefly share what you'd like, a little bit about your background, perhaps professional interest, what your current position entails, please.
Sure. So my position is Curator-at-Large here at the Peabody Essex Museum, and that's a title that sort of denotes my ability to work across collections. My focus for many years has been with our maritime collections, but the early history of the museum is something I did a deep dive in, and
Hmm.
that sort of informed a lot of the research and the shaping of the story that's now presented in East India Marine Hall.
You know, the East India Marine Hall has always been central to Salem's global history. What's been the reopening made that so significant?
It's comes at a great moment for the museum to be able to tell the story anew of the origins of the institution in a way that people can now understand why this museum is here and why we have certain collections and and how we display, how we connect cultures throughout the globe really started in 1799 with the origins of the institution known as the East India Marine Society, which is the founding entity that is now today the Peabody Essex Museum.
How would you describe what's changed most from the previous installation to what visitors experience today?
Yeah, well, my colleague Dan Finnemore and I, who worked on the project together, um, we had kind of tighter lens in the objects that we considered for installation in the hall. We wanted to tell this early story of these 22 mariners who formed a marine society called the East India Marine Society when Salem was very much an international port and sort of in the new United States. Salem and American merchants were now not under the British colonial system, not under British imperial um, navigation acts and everything that sort of like shaped the nature of trade before then, but they were free to sort of go about the globe. And Salem was very much a pioneer in that voyaging to different parts of the world, meeting new people, trading with people, and bringing back not only goods but objects. So we had a lens of looking at the collection that this East India Marine Society had gathered over a 68-year period and used that collection, and much of it still remains in the museum,
Mhm.
about 2,000 objects that we consider
Wow.
Yeah, quite a
That's
lot to
incredible.
get down to a checklist of about 430 some odd objects. So
Amazing.
it was a mighty lift across a lot of departments to work on this project. But that was sort of our lens, plus the figureheads, which have become very iconic for the hall. And they were installed in the 1940s during what I would say was the third major shift or third major installation in the hall. And I would consider this one to be kind of the fourth, like new uh,
Mhm.
envisioning of what this space looked like. And one that we were hoping to look back at this origin story, but presented in a way where it both was historic and contemporary at the same time. And I think when we show some images of that, when people visit, I think they'll hopefully get that same um, feel.
Building on that as far as your guiding vision for the installation, what were some challenges in accomplishing that goal?
Um, this is a large, very large hall. It's about 100 by 45 feet.
Wow.
Big space that has 22-foot high ceilings. Uh, so there's always lighting challenges, sound challenges, um, daylight changing and so forth. So, sort of the environment has always been challenging and one that actually is not conducive to labels, has never been. So in terms of our interpretation system, that both presented some challenges but opportunities in terms of how we're able to deliver information in the space. And I can get into that, I think, a little bit later when we dive into that aspect of it. But just a very large, number of objects. And so it took coordination across a lot of departments, registration,
Mm.
collections, design, and media, and so forth. But it was an institutional priority. Uh, so everyone bought in, everyone was behind it, and sort of the people who helped support the project were definitely behind it as well. So I think just the challenge of this, unique space, I would say, in Salem in America, because it's one of the few, we're the oldest continually operating museum in the country, and Easton Marine Hall is one of the oldest, exhibit spaces dating to 1825, and one that, is, unlike another in the country. So that's always a challenge. You're presented with this historic space. How do you do justice to it without being, looking back fully or trying to reinstall something that had already been done? How can we do both? So that challenge, I think we met, and so far the reactions have been very positive, and sort of like having this space that both tells people about the origins of the institution, but also makes sense as to why the museum has certain collections and why they're presented in the way that we do, and why do we do the programs we do. It's very much bringing East Indian Marine Hall back as sort of the heart of the museum, but
Mhm.
also under giving people, visitors, patrons, everyone who comes to the museum an understanding of like, well, here's where it started, and this is who we are today. There are, looking at the human experience, the commonalities, engaging in curiosity and wonder today started in 1799.
Right, terrific. For those who haven't had the chance to revisit the hall yet, we're fortunate that you've assembled a selection of images to provide us with a behind-the-scenes tour as you start us on this tour of the hall. What do you hope visitors feel when they first walk in and take it all in, see this new creation?
Well, we love visitors to just sort of like, come into this space and have a sense of, just, awe of wonder as they enter this, very large, light-filled room. Um, and have an experience that sort of ties to prior visitors to the hall who came into the space. Um, And back then, today we have actually going back to some of the challenges. Today we have multiple ways of getting in and out of East India Marine Hall. But back in the
Ah,
19th century, there was only one way, and you would go up a staircase and enter this hall, enter this space. And many people sort of, you know, felt like there was the poet Hannah Flagg Gould had said that it was as if she was touched by an enchanter's wand, and sort of
mm.
like sent through to the bosom of the ocean and around the world. And there was another visitor named George Cheney who came in here and said to walk around was to circumnavigate the globe, and said that he was able to enter the chambers of all nations and come home in one afternoon. So, this kind of sense of voyaging, sense of discovery.
Building on that, there's no set path really through the hall. Why was it important to let visitors follow their own curiosity?
We felt that that was sort of something that has always been in the hall. And going back to your question about like challenges, this was a challenge in that most of our temporary exhibitions or our permanent gallery installations, they have an intro panel and there are sections and there's a prescribed path to sort of wander through. Not everyone, everyone goes at their own pace or may go different ways, but at least the design has that intent. Here, we have a completely different approach, one where we give an intro panel. You can see the Welcome to East India Marine Hall there. And around the hall, we have these, our designer, Dave Seibert, had called buoys to give it the sort of maritime feel,
Mm,
to give sort of ideas related to the story. We call them concept panels. Uh, but it's not a linear experience.
mhm,
And it's one where you can go around, you can read, see the intro panel, read some of these uh, other concept panels and get an understanding of different concepts, but there's no order that you have to do that in, or if you have to, do that at all. But every case, and you can see here also with the this view looking sort of south in the building, we have a lot of cases that are
mm,
brand new that sort of then speak to this sort of like contemporary feel. And we have historic cases, but each case has objects that relate to any number of these concept panels and more. So you can go about and your experience in the hall, if you are fortunate to be able to visit more than once, can be different every time. I
mhm,
sort of have said to people already that like I will never give the same tour twice.
mm.
And I find that to be just wonderful. I mean, what an opportunity. You can do different things. You might learn different things about different objects and you want to highlight different things. Depends on your group that you're touring, that I'm touring around, or my colleagues are touring around might have different interests and you can highlight things that speak to their interest. But going around, you really have um, the opportunity to see and learn different things. Here we have, sort of a depiction of different portraits in different forms, three-dimensional portraits and portraits of mariners. Nathaniel Bowditch on the left, who was one of the founding members and also one of the most prominent ones, the only one to have his portrait actually displayed in Eastern Marine Hall. And on the very right is the portrait of Nasirvanji Manakjay Wadia, who was part of a very principal trading family in India that traded with American merchants who were coming in the early 1800s, and he gave his portrait as a way of wanting to have his story displayed in the hall. So these, stories abound, and you have multiple ways of gaining information, gaining understanding as you take your own path around Eastern Marine Hall. We have, as you can see in this sort of intro panel that's on the right, that is sort of a good architecture for someone who's coming to this space that may have never come to the Peabody Essex Museum before and is
Mhm.
entering Eastern Marine Hall. And this gives really a very distilled understanding of why the space is here, why it was created, what is the origin of the institution and how does that connect to who we are today as the Peabody Essex Museum. And within that sort of large intro kiosk are books that present information in a manner that you would have had in the 1800s if you were walking around. It's a catalog that
Mhm.
has every object in every case, organized by the case of the wall section, and gives just basic information, what we call in the museum world the tombstone information. So if you're going
Mhm.
to an exhibit, most of the objects on exhibit will have a placard that gives you, the artist, the title, what it's made of, when it was given to the institution. That basic information is available uh, here, but we have, in order sort of to make it fresh and contemporary, we have a new method of delivering this information. You can do it that way. And in the 19th century, that was written by the Marine Society members. So it was, their understanding of what
Mhm.
they had and presenting that to people. But in every case, in the gallery or every wall section, actually, you could see one near the figurehead in this picture, there is a placard with a QR code. And if you take out your phone, you'll get immediately and scan the QR code. Your phone will bring up a browser, what's called a progressive web app. So not anything you have to download. And it's the portal into the digital interpretation system in the gallery, which gives you all the basic information and an image of each object. But for 36 objects around the gallery, it gives you the ability to do a deep dive and hear from cultural practitioners in different parts of the globe talking about these objects. So giving perspective that in the 1800s, when you just had the catalog or maybe you had a member of the Marine Society taking you around, that wouldn't have been available. Here we have that available. We also the ability to give for about 100 objects in the gallery annotations. So what you would be accustomed to in other exhibitions where you can, read a little bit about the object. But it's not a static system, which is the offers us a real opportunity that we could keep adding to it. If someone comes in who's an expert in some uh, on a certain object or types of objects and have information they want to give, we can take that information in. They could write an annotation. We can record them because many of the deep dives for the objects around the gallery are audio. So you actually hear from people from different parts of the globe talking about these objects.
Now, I was so impressed with the QR code, so comprehensive and detailed, multiple perspectives, and a wonderful resource to take back with you from the museum to learn so much more, sort of as an independent study, sort of as going through the museum on your own, which is one of the charges that you and your colleagues put in the design. You can follow up sort of a similar way when you're outside the museum because it's just so rich doing that. You've also incorporated voices from cultures these objects came from. How did that shape the final exhibition?
Yeah, I mean that was one of the most gratifying parts of the project. We had brought together um, scholars, curators, artists in different parts of the world, at Fiji, Hawaii, and the Marquesas Islands, through our curatorial colleagues here at the museum, sort of this network. But we were able to reach out, tell them about this project. Some of them had come to the museum, knew about the collection. Um, and but thanks to the technology that we're using now, be able to have conversations with them that normally would be very challenging, especially for somewhere far
Mhm.
away as New Zealand, and talking to our colleague who is a curator at the Te Papa Museum. So that the familiarity with some of the collection, but just presenting them with like here are some of the objects we're thinking about putting in East India Marine Hall and getting their reaction to what they think would resonated, and so that helped we had an idea of what we wanted in terms of different parts of the collection to show, and then through this collaboration, you sort of refine that lens. And really, I think it's sort of fair to say that all my colleagues here, when we were doing some of these interviews, I mean, we learned a lot about some of
True.
these objects. So it's wonderful now to be able to present that. And that's sort of that's the kind of evolving nature of this space. And that's actually one of those concept panels talks about that, evolving not in terms of like how physically it looks, but evolving in sort of like the way we look at objects and how these objects have been interpreted in the past and how they could be interpreted anew in our present moment.
How is the hall being used as a learning space for students and the broader community?
Well, I think we have great opportunities, and I think as you know, since the space just opened uh, a few weeks ago, and everyone's now getting an opportunity to go through it and figure out our opportunities going forward. I mean, we've always had, Eastern Marine Hall has always been a active space for school groups, an active space for other kind of public programming. Um, and now within this, new configuration, what are the opportunities to be able to have the continuity of like the school groups, the tour groups, taking people through, and what new opportunities might we be able to, sort of take hold of, or new ideas that might work in the space. So I think that's sort of in the future upcoming, um, as we continue to get a sense of how people are reacting to the hall, how people are moving in the hall, how we can form sort of new types of programs to activate the space.
Well, building on that, I know it's still very early, but what kinds of conversations or engagement have you already seen since the reopening?
Yeah, I mean, I've walked around, my colleagues have walked around, we've gotten a sense of how people are engaging with the digital system and the analog system. And there's, I think, kind of a balance there. Some people are using the, their phones and, being able to like use them anew in a different way.
Yeah,
And some people are enjoying using the books. So it's sort of gratifying to see that, there's an interest in both. And it shows that people like I think are taking advantage of the opportunity to discover on their own and sort of, forge that path through East India Marine Hall. So
definitely. Definitely.
we've seen that. We've gotten reaction from people who are a long time, have a long connection to the museum and seeing some objects that are familiar to them. And sort of wistful associations, with seeing this thing, some of these objects haven't been in the hall for a long time. There are familiar ones that have been, there are ones that are maybe new to people. But there's that, connection to the past, but we're also seeing and think that this will be a trajectory of new younger visitors coming in and finding the objects that speak to them.
Mm,
This is sort of like that's the continuing narrative of the story. When I did a lot of research on the early history of the museum, that informed my doctoral work, and then a book on the origins of the museum and as the
mm.
East India Marine Society. One thing I was fascinated with was unearthing sort of names of people who came to East India Marine Hall and how that was very much a global story because wasn't just people from Salem or the North Shore or even the greater, Boston area, but
Mm.
all over the United States and other countries. Um, and finding through some names accounts that they wrote, maybe personal diary entries or published pieces that where they had an experience that I think many people have today, one of discovery and wonder, of engaging with these objects, but also finding the objects that spoke to them personally, and which I think is a commonality that visitors, all of us that visit museums, have today.
How does the reinstallation fit into the broader mission of the museum going forward?
Yes. So, the museum celebrates this sort of hu celebrates these human-centered stories, celebrates the commonalities we have across the globe and the um, ideas of, that are core to curiosity and to wonder. And the hall really speaks to that. It gives people a sense of this is why the Peabody Essex Museum is doing what they're doing, or in their programs and their exhibitions. That it started at the beginning of the institution in 1799, when Salem mariners were going across the globe and bringing back objects to Salem and putting them on display in the museum as sort of a civic-minded, endeavor, wanting to educate, wanting to open people's eyes to, in one ways, here's Salem and America now trying to, make a name in the world, but also to really to understand that, we have commonalities with people across the globe. The mariners who formed the museum, they collected things that spoke to them. There's tons and tons of fish hooks in the collection. We have a little display of that to give people a sense that, these were, Salem captains, seafarers from a seacoast community engaging with people who were mariners, who were seafarers, who lived by the sea. And so that experience resonated with them, and they bring that back to Salem.
In the closing minute or so left, what's been most meaningful to you personally in bringing this project to life?
Having had the fortune of coming to the museum as a little kid, not growing up in Salem. I grew up in New York City, and then working here professionally for many, many years, and knowing about this space and really doing a deep dive into why Eastern Marine Hall was built in 1825, what was the institution that built it, and who they were, and what their intentions were creating this museum, and then getting to actually take all that research and writing about it and see it come to life in many ways in this new installation is, I think it's a once in a lifetime, opportunity. I feel that the hall, based on writing and so forth, the hall was built in 1825. It was part of the Eastern Marine Society's museum until 1867. The museum then became the Peabody Academy of Science, and Eastern Marine Hall sort of changed in its internal structure, was sort of focused on natural history. And that installation went until 1940. And then there was as the Peabody Museum of Salem at that time, there was then, a look back at, let's see if we can make the hall sort of reflect the early history. And there was sort of a mix of maritime history, but global exploration, and global connections in that new installation that opened in 1943. And that lasted until about 2016, when we constructed a new building that's on the other side of Eastern Marine Hall. And because of sort of the vibrations and all the dust from the construction, we had to deinstall the remaining cases that were in Eastern Marine Hall. And so that gave us the opportunity now to sort of celebrate the bicentennial of Eastern Marine Hall and this sort of fourth iteration, this new installation of the hall that I think really at this moment is, the perfect time to give people a sense of
Oh,
this of the history of the museum.
most definitely. And as you just put it, wonderfully, something to celebrate indeed. George, unfortunately, we've come to the end of the program. I want to thank you again so much for taking the time to be here. Congratulations again to you and your colleagues for what you've accomplished. The reinstallation warrants many, many visits in the near future to totally appreciate the work. So just want to end by wishing you continued success with future endeavors.
Well, thank you so much, Jade. Thank you for having me, and I welcome everyone to come up and see the new installation East Indian Marine Hall.
Wonderful, wonderful. Also want to thank those of you watching for joining us and hope you'll be able to tune in next time.